Part 1. The ship moved slowly across the Red Sea, through the shrouding veils of mist, her sail barely filled with the languid thrust of the wind. Her hull, of a light thin metal, floated without sound, the surface of the strange ocean parting before her prow in silent rippling streamers of flame. Light deepened toward the ship, a river of indigo flowing out of the west. The man known as Stark stood alone by the after rail and watched its coming. He was full of impatience and a gathering sense of danger, so it seemed to him that even the hot wind smelled of it. The steersman lay drowsily over his sweep. He was a big man, with skin and hair the color of milk. He did not speak, but Stark felt that now and again the man's eyes turned toward him, pale and calculating under half-closed lids, with a secret avarice. The captain and the two other members of the little coasting vessel's crew were forward, at their evening meal. Once or twice Stark heard a burst of laughter, half-whispered and furtive. It was as though all four shared in some private joke, from which he was rigidly excluded. The heat was oppressive. Sweat gathered on Stark's dark face. His shirt stuck to his back. The air was heavy with moisture, tainted with the muddy fecundity of the land that brooded westward behind the eternal fog. There was something ominous about the sea itself. Even on its own world, the Red Sea is hardly more than a legend. It lies behind the mountains of white cloud, the great barrier wall that hides away half a planet. Few men have gone beyond that barrier, into the vast mystery of inner Venus. Fewer still have come back. Stark was one of that handful. 3 times he had crossed the mountains, and once he had stayed for nearly a year, but he had never quite grown used to the Red Sea. It was not water. It was gaseous, dense enough to float the buoyant hulls of the metal ships, and it burned perpetually with its deep inner fires. The mists that clouded it were stained with the bloody glow. Beneath the surface Stark could see the drifts of flame where the lazy currents ran, and the little coiling bursts of sparks that came upward and spread and melted into other bursts, so that the face of the sea was like a cosmos of crimson stars. It was very beautiful, glowing against the blue, luminous darkness of the night. Beautiful and strange. There was a padding of bare feet, and the captain, Malthor, came up to Stark, his outlines dim and ghostly in the gloom. "We will reach Shuruun," he said, "before the second glass is run." Stark nodded. Good. The voyage had seemed endless, and the close confinement of the narrow deck had gotten badly on his nerves. "You will like Shuruun," said the captain jovially. "Our wine, our food, our women, all superb. We don't have many visitors. We keep to ourselves, as you will see. But those who do come—" He laughed and clapped Stark on the shoulder. "Ah, yes, you will be happy in Shuruun." It seemed to Stark that he had caught an echo of laughter from the unseen crew, as though they listened and found a hidden jest in Malthor's words. Stark said, "That's fine." "Perhaps," said Malthor, "you would like to lodge with me. I could make you a good price." He had made a good price for Stark's passage up the coast, an exorbitantly good one. Stark said, "No." "You don't have to be afraid," said the Venusian in a confidential tone. "The strangers who come to Shuruun all have the same reason. It's a good place to hide. We're out of everybody's reach." He paused, but Stark did not rise to his bait. Presently he chuckled and went on. "In fact, it's such a safe place that most of the strangers decide to stay on. Now, at my house, I could give you—" Stark said again, flatly, "No." The captain shrugged. "Very well. Think it over anyway." He peered ahead into the red, coiling mists. "Ah, see there?" He pointed, and Stark made out the shadowy loom of cliffs. "We're coming into the strait now." Malthor turned and took the steering sweep himself, the helmsman going forward to join the others. The ship began to pick up speed. Stark saw that she had come into the grip of a current that swept toward the cliffs, a river of fire ever more swiftly in the depths of the sea. The dark walls seemed to plunge toward them. At first Stark could see no passage. Then, suddenly, a narrow crimson streak appeared, widened, and became a gut of boiling flame, rushing silently around broken rocks. Red fog rose like smoke. The ship quivered, sprang ahead, and tore like a mad thing into the heart of the inferno. In spite of himself, Stark's hands tightened on the rail. Tattered veils of mist swirled past them. The sea, the air, the ship itself, seemed drenched in blood. There was no sound, in all that wild sweep of current through the strait. Only the sullen fires burst and flowed. The reflected glare showed Stark that the straits of Shuruun were defended. Squat fortresses brooded on the cliffs. There were ballistas and great windlasses for the drawing of nets across the narrow throat. The men of Shuruun could enforce their law, that barred all foreign shipping from their gulf. They had reason for such a law, and such a defense. The legitimate trade of Shuruun, such as it was in wine and the delicate laces woven from spider silk. Actually, however, the city lived and throve on piracy, the arts of wrecking, and a contraband trade in the distilled juice of the Vila poppy. Looking at the rocks and the fortresses, Stark could understand how it was that Shuruun had been able for more centuries than anyone could tell to victimize the shipping of the Red Sea, and offer a refuge to the outlaw, the wolf's head, the breaker of taboo. With startling abruptness, they were through the gut and drifting on the still surface of this all but landlocked arm of the Red Sea. Because of the shrouding fog, Stark could see nothing of the land. But the smell of it was stronger, warm damp soil and the heavy, faintly rotten perfume of vegetation, half jungle, half swamp. Once, through a rift in the wreathing vapor, he thought he glimpsed the shadowy bulk of an island, but it was gone at once. After the terrifying rush of the strait, it seemed to Stark that the ship barely moved. His impatience and the subtle sense of danger deepened. He began to pace the deck, with the nervous, velted motion of a prowling cat. The moist, steamy air seemed all but unbreathable after the clean dryness of Mars, from whence he had come so recently. It was oppressively still. Suddenly he stopped, his head thrown back, listening. The sound was borne faintly on the slow wind. It came from everywhere and nowhere, a vague dim thing without source or direction. It almost seemed that the night itself had spoken, the hot blue night of Venus, crying out in the mists with the tongue of infinite woe. It faded and died away, only half heard, leaving behind it a sense of aching sadness, as though all the misery and longing of the world had found voice in that desolate wail. Stark shivered. For a time there was silence, and then he heard the sound again, now on a deeper note. Still faint and far away, it was sustained longer by the vagaries of the heavy air, and it became a chant, rising and falling. There were no words. It was not the sort of thing that would have need of words. Then it was gone again. Stark turned to Malthor. What was that? The man looked at him curiously. He seemed not to have heard. "That wailing sound," said Stark impatiently. "Oh, that," the Venusian shrugged. "A trick of the wind. It sighs in the hollow rocks around the strait." He yawned, giving place again to the steersman, and came to stand beside Stark. The Earthman ignored him. For some reason, that sound, half heard through the mists, had brought his uneasiness to a sharp pitch. Civilization had brushed over Stark with a light hand. Raised from infancy by half-human aboriginals, his perceptions were still those of a savage. His ear was good. Malthor lied. That cry of pain was not made by any wind. "I have known several Earthmen," said Malthor, changing the subject, but not too swiftly. "None of them were like you." Intuition warned Stark to play along. "I don't come from Earth," he said. "I come from Mercury." Malthor puzzled over that. Venus is a cloudy world where no man has ever seen the sun, let alone a star. The captain had heard vaguely of these things. Earth and Mars he knew of, but Mercury was an unknown word. Stark explained, "The planet nearest the sun. It's very hot there. The sun blazes like a huge fire. There are no clouds to shield it." "Ah, that's why your skin is so dark." He held his own pale forearm close to Stark's and shook his head. "I've never seen such skin," he said admiringly. "Nor such great muscles." Looking up, he went on in a tone of complete friendliness. "I wish you would stay with me. You'll find no better lodgings in Shuruun. And I warn you, there are people in town who will take advantage of strangers, rob them, even slay them. Now, I'm known by all as a man of honor. You could sleep soundly under my roof." He paused, then added with a smile, "Also, I have a daughter. An excellent cook, and very beautiful." The woeful chanting came again, dim and distant on the wind, an echo of warning against some unimagined fate. Stark said for the third time, "No." He needed no intuition to tell him to walk wide of the captain. The man was a rogue, and not a very subtle one. A flint-hard, angry look came briefly into Malthor's eyes. "You're a stubborn man. You'll find that Shuruun is no place for stubbornness." He turned and went away. Stark remained where he was. The ship drifted on through a slow eternity of time. And all down that long, still gulf of the Red Sea, through the heat and the wreathing fog, the ghostly chanting haunted him, like the keening of lost souls in some forgotten hell. Presently the course of the ship was altered. Malthor came again to the afterdeck, giving a few quiet commands. Stark saw land ahead, a darker blur on the night, and then the shrouded outlines of a city. Torches blazed on the quays and in the streets, and the low buildings caught a ruddy glow from the burning sea itself. A squat and ugly town, Shuruun, crouching witch-like on the rocky shore, her ragged skirts dipped in blood. The ship drifted toward the quays. Stark heard a whisper of movement behind him, the hushed and purposeful padding of naked feet. He turned, with the astonishing swiftness of an animal that feels itself threatened, his hand dropping to his gun. A belaying pin, thrown by the steersman, struck the side of his head with stunning force. Reeling, half-blinded, he saw the distorted shapes of men closing in upon him. Malthor's voice sounded low and hard. A second belaying pin whizzed through the air and cracked against Stark's shoulder. Hands were laid upon him. Bodies, heavy and strong, bore his down. Malthor laughed. Stark's teeth glinted bare and white. Someone's cheek brushed past, and he sank them into the flesh. He began to growl, a sound that should never come from a human throat. It seemed to the startled Venusians that the man they had attacked had by some wizardry become a beast, at the first touch of violence. The man with the torn cheek screamed. There was a voiceless scuffling on the deck, a terrible intensity of motion, and then the great dark body rose and shook itself free of the tangle, and was gone, over the rail, leaving Malthor with nothing but the silken rags of a shirt in his hands. The surface of the Red Sea closed without a ripple over Stark. There was a burst of crimson sparks, a momentary trail of flame going down like a drowned comet, and then nothing. Part 2 of Enchantress of Venus. Stark dropped slowly downward through a strange world. There was no difficulty about breathing, as in a sea of water. The gases of the Red Sea support life quite well, and the creatures that dwell in it have almost normal lungs. Stark did not pay much attention at first, except to keep his balance automatically. He was still dazed from the blow, and he was raging with anger and pain. The primitive in him, whose name was not Stark but N'Chaka, and who had fought and starved and hunted in the blazing valleys of Mercury's twilight belt, learning lessons he never forgot, wished to return and slay Malthor and his men. He regretted that he had not torn out their throats, for now his trail would never be safe from them. But the man Stark, who had learned some more bitter lessons in the name of civilization, knew the unwisdom of that. He snarled over his aching head, and cursed the Venusians in the harsh, crude dialect that was his mother tongue, but he did not turn back. There would be time enough for Malthor. It struck him that the gulf was very deep. Fighting down his rage, he began to swim in the direction of the shore. There was no sign of pursuit, and he judged that Malthor had decided to let him go. He puzzled over the reason for the attack. It could hardly be robbery, since he carried nothing but the clothes he stood in, and very little money. No, there was some deeper reason. A reason connected with Malthor's insistence that he lodge with him. Stark smiled. It was not a pleasant smile. He was thinking of Shuruun, and the things men said about it, around the shores of the Red Sea. Then his face hardened. The dim coiling fires through which he swam brought him memories of other times he had gone adventuring in the depths of the Red Sea. He had not been alone then. Helvi had gone with him, the tall son of a barbarian kinglet up coast by Yarel. They had hunted strange beasts through the crystal forests of the sea bottom and bathed in the welling flames that pulsed from the very heart of Venus to feed the ocean. They had been brothers. Helvi was gone, to Shuruun. He had never returned. Stark swam on, and presently he saw below him in the red gloom something that made him drop lower, frowning with surprise. There were trees beneath him, great forest giants towering up into an eerie sky, their branches swaying gently to the slow wash of the currents. Stark was puzzled. The forests where he and Helvi had hunted were truly crystalline, without even the memory of life. The trees were no more trees in actuality than the branching corals of Terra's southern oceans. But these were real, or had been. He thought at first that they still lived, for their leaves were green, and here and there creepers had starred them with great nodding blossoms of gold and purple and waxy white. But when he floated down close enough to touch them, he realized that they were dead. Trees, creepers, blossoms, all. They had not mummified, nor turned to stone. They were pliable, and their colors were very bright. Simply, they had ceased to live, and the gases of the sea had preserved them by some chemical magic, so perfectly that barely a leaf had fallen. Stark did not venture into the shadowy denseness below the topmost branches. A strange fear came over him, at the sight of that vast forest dreaming in the depths of the gulf, drowned and forgotten, as though wondering why the birds had gone, taking with them the warm rains and the light of day. He thrust his way upward, himself like a huge dark bird above the branches. An overwhelming impulse to get away from that unearthly place drove him on, his half-wild sense shuddering with an impression of evil so great that it took all his acquired common sense to assure him that he was not pursued by demons. He broke the surface at last, to find that he had lost direction in the red deep and made a long circle around, so that he was far below Shuruun. He made his way back, not hurrying now, and presently clambered out over the black rocks. He stood at the end of a muddy lane that wandered in toward the town. He followed it, moving neither fast nor slow, but with a wary alertness. Huts of wattle and daub took shape out of the fog, increased in numbers, became a street of dwellings. Here and there rushlights glimmered through the slitted windows. A man and a woman clung together in a low doorway. They saw him and sprang apart, and the woman gave a little cry. Stark went on. He did not look back, but he knew that they were following him quietly, at a little distance. The lane twisted snake-like upon itself, crawling now through a crowded jumble of houses. There were more lights, and more people, tall white-skinned folk of the swamp edges, with pale eyes and long hair the color of new flax, and the faces of wolves. Stark passed among them, alien and strange with his black hair and sun-darkened skin. They did not speak, nor try to stop him. They only looked at him out of the red fog, with a curious blend of amusement and fear, and some of them followed him, keeping well behind. A gang of small naked children came from somewhere among the houses and ran shouting beside him, out of reach, until one boy threw a stone and screamed something unintelligible except for one word, Luhari. Then they all stopped, horrified, and fled. Stark went on, through the quarter of the lace-makers, heading by instinct toward the wharves. The glow of the Red Sea pervaded all the air, so that it seemed as though the mist was full of tiny drops of blood. There was a smell about the place he did not like, a damp miasma of mud and crowding bodies and wine, and the breath of the Vila poppy. Shuruun was an unclean town, and it stank of evil. There was something else about it, a subtle thing that touched Stark's nerves with a chill finger. He could see the shadow of it in the eyes of the people, hear its undertone in their voices. The wolves of Shuruun did not feel safe in their own kennel. Unconsciously, as this feeling grew upon him, Stark's step grew more and more wary, his eyes more cold and hard. He came out into a broad square by the harbour front. He could see the ghostly ships moored along the quays, the piled casks of wine, the tangled masts and cordage dim against the background of the burning gulf. There were many torches here. Large low buildings stood around the square. There was laughter and the sound of voices from the dark verandas, and somewhere a woman sang to the melancholy lifting of a reed pipe. A suffused glow of light in the distance ahead caught Stark's eye. That way the streets sloped to a higher ground, and straining his vision against the fog, he made out very dimly the tall bulk of a castle crouched on the low cliffs, looking with bright eyes upon the night, and the streets of Shuruun. Stark hesitated briefly. Then he started across the square toward the largest of the taverns. There were a number of people in the open space, mostly sailors and their women. They were loose and foolish with wine, but even so they stopped where they were and stared at the dark stranger, and then drew back from him, still staring. Those who had followed Stark came into the square after him and then paused, spreading out in an aimless sort of way to join with other groups, whispering among themselves. The woman stopped singing in the middle of a phrase. A curious silence fell on the square. A nervous semblance ran round and round under the silence, and men came slowly out from the verandas and the doors of the wine shops. Suddenly a woman with dishevelled hair pointed her arm at Stark and laughed, the shrieking laugh of a harpy. Stark found his way barred by three tall young men with hard mouths and crafty eyes, who smiled at him as hounds smile before the kill. "Stranger," they said, "Earthman." "Outlaw," answered Stark, and it was only half a lie. One of the young men took a step forward. "Did you fly like a dragon over the mountains of White Cloud? Did you drop from the sky?" "I came on Malthor's ship." A kind of sigh went around the square, and with it the name of Malthor. The eager faces of the young men grew heavy with disappointment. But the leader said sharply, "I was on the quay when Malthor docked. You were not on board." It was Stark's turn to smile. In the light of the torches, his eyes blazed cold and bright as ice against the sun. "Ask Malthor the reason for that," he said. "Ask the man with the torn cheek. Or perhaps," he added softly, "you would like to learn for yourselves." The young men looked at him, scowling, in an odd mood of indecision. Stark settled himself, every muscle loose and ready. And the woman who had laughed crept closer and peered at Stark through her tangled hair, breathing heavily of the poppy wine. All at once she said loudly, "He came out of the sea. That's where he came from. He's—" One of the young men struck her across the mouth, and she fell down in the mud. A burly seaman ran out and caught her by the hair, dragging her to her feet again. His face was frightened and very angry. He hauled the woman away, cursing her for a fool and beating her as he went. She spat out blood and said no more. "Well," said Stark to the young men, "have you made up your minds?" "Minds," said a voice behind them, a harsh timbered, rasping voice that handled the liquid vocables of the Venusian speech very clumsily indeed. "They have no minds, these whelps. If they had, they'd be off about their business, instead of standing here badgering a stranger." The young men turned, and now between them Stark could see the man who had spoken. He stood on the steps of the tavern. He was an Earthman, and at first Stark thought he was old, because his hair was white and his face deeply lined. His body was wasted with fever, the muscles all gone to knotty strings twisted over bone. He leaned heavily on a stick, and one leg was crooked and terribly scarred. He grinned at Stark and said, in colloquial English, "Watch me get rid of 'em." He began to tongue-lash the young men, telling them they were idiots, the misbegotten offspring of swamp toads, utterly without manners, and that if they did not believe the stranger's story, they should go ask Malthor, as he suggested. Finally he shook his stick at them, fairly screeching, "Go on, now! Go away! Leave us alone! My brother of Earth and I!" The young men gave one hesitant glance at Stark's feral eyes. Then they looked at each other and shrugged, and went away across the square half sheepishly, like great loutish boys caught in some misdemeanor. The white-haired Earthman beckoned to Stark, and, as Stark came up to him on the steps, he said under his breath, almost angrily, "You are in a trap." Stark glanced over his shoulder. At the edge of the square the three young men had met a fourth, who had his face bound up in a rag. They vanished almost at once into a side street, but not before Stark had recognized the fourth man as Malthor. It was the captain he had branded. With loud cheerfulness the lame man said in Venusian, "Come in and drink with me, brother, and we will talk of Earth." Part 3 of Enchantress of Venus. The tavern was of the standard low-class Venusian pattern, a single huge room under bare thatch, the wall half open with the reed shutters rolled up, the floor of split logs propped up on the piling out of the mud. A long low bar, little tables, mangy skins and heaps of dubious cushions on the floor around them, and at one end the entertainers, two old men with a drum and a reed pipe, and a couple of sulky, tired-looking girls. The lame man led Stark to a table in the corner and sat down, calling for wine. His eyes, which were dark and haunted by long pain, burned with excitement. His hands shook. Before Stark had sat down he had begun to talk, his words stumbling over themselves as though he could not get them out fast enough. "How is it there now? Has it changed any? Tell me how it is, the cities, the lights, the paved streets, the women, the sun. Oh, Lord, what I wouldn't give to see the sun again, and women with dark hair and their clothes on." He leaned forward, staring hungrily into Stark's face, as though he could see those things mirrored there. "For God's sake, talk to me in English, tell me about Earth." "How long have you been here?" asked Stark. "I don't know. How do you reckon time on a world without a sun, without one damn little star to look at? 10 years, 100 years, how should I know? Forever. Tell me about Earth." Stark smiled wryly. "I haven't been there for a long time. The police were too ready with a welcoming committee. But the last time I saw it, it was just the same." The lame man shivered. He was not looking at Stark now, but at some place far beyond him. "Autumn woods," he said, "red and gold on the brown hills. Snow. I can remember how it felt to be cold. The air bit you when you breathed it. And the women wore high-heeled slippers. No big bare feet trumping in the mud, but little sharp heels tapping on clean pavement." Suddenly he glared at Stark, his eyes furious and bright with tears. "Why the hell did you have to come here and start me remembering? I'm Larrabee. I live in Shuruun. I've been here forever, and I'll be here till I die. There isn't any earth. It's gone. Just look up into the sky, and you'll know it's gone. There's nothing anywhere but clouds, and Venus, and mud." He sat still, shaking, turning his head from side to side. A man came with the wine, put it down, and went away again. The tavern was very quiet. There was a wide space empty around the two Earthmen. Beyond that people lay on the cushions, sipping the poppy wine and watching with a sort of furtive expectancy. Abruptly Larrabee laughed, a harsh sound that held a certain honest mirth. "I don't know why I should get sentimental about Earth at this late date. Never thought much about it when I was there." Nevertheless, he kept his gaze averted, and when he picked up his cup his hand trembled so that he spilled some of the wine. Stark was staring at him in unbelief. "Larrabee," he said, "you're Mike Larrabee. You're the man who got 500,000 credits out of the strong room of the Royal Venus." Larrabee nodded. "And got away with it, right over the mountains of white cloud, that they said it couldn't be flown. And do you know where that 500,000 is now? At the bottom of the Red Sea, along with my ship and my crew, out there in the Gulf. Lord knows why I lived." He shrugged. "Well, anyway, I was headed for Shuruun when I crashed, and I got here. So why complain?" He drank again, deeply, and Stark shook his head. "You've been here 9 years, then, by Earth time," he said. He had never met Larrabee, but he remembered the pictures of him that had flashed across the space on police bands. Larrabee had been a young man then, dark and proud and handsome. Larrabee guessed his thought. "I've changed, haven't I?" Stark said lamely, "Everybody thought you were dead." Larrabee laughed. After that, for a moment, there was silence. Stark's ears were straining for any sound outside. There was none. He said abruptly, "What about this trap I'm in?" "I'll tell you one thing about it," said Larrabee. "There's no way out. I can't help you. I wouldn't if I could. Get that straight. But I can't anyway." "Thanks," Stark said sourly. "You can at least tell me what goes on." "Listen," said Larrabee. "I'm a cripple and an old man, and Shuruun isn't the sweetest place in the solar system to live. But I do live. I have a wife, a slatternly wench, I'll admit, but good enough in her way. You'll notice some dark little haired brats rolling in the mud. They're mine, too. I have some skill at setting bones and such, and so I can get drunk for nothing as often as I will, which is often. Also, because of this bum leg, I'm perfectly safe. So don't ask me what goes on. I take great pains not to know." Stark said, "Who are the Luhari?" "Would you like to meet them?" Larrabee seemed to find something very amusing in that thought. "Just go on up to the castle. They live there. They're the lords of Shuruun, and they're always glad to meet strangers." He leaned forward suddenly. "Who are you, anyway? What's your name, and why the devil did you come here?" "My name is Stark, and I came here for the same reason you did." "Stark," repeated Larrabee slowly, his eyes intent. "That rings a faint bell. Seems to me I saw a wanted flash once. Some idiot that had led a native revolt somewhere in the Jovian colonies. A big, cold-eyed brute they referred to colourfully as the wild man from Mercury." He nodded, pleased with himself. "Wild man, eh? Well, Shuruun will tame you down." "Perhaps," said Stark. His eyes shifted constantly, watching Larrabee, watching the doorway and the dark veranda and the people who drank but did not talk among themselves. "Speaking of strangers, one came here at the time of the last rains. He was Venusian, from up coast. A big young man. I used to know him. Perhaps he could help me." Larrabee snorted. By now he had drunk his own wine and Stark's too. "Nobody can help you. As for your friend, I never saw him. I'm beginning to think I should never have seen you." Quite suddenly he caught up his stick and got with some difficulty to his feet. He did not look at Stark, but said harshly, "You'd better get out of here." Then he turned and limped unsteadily to the bar. Stark rose. He glanced after Larrabee, and again his nostrils twitched to the smell of fear. He went out of the tavern the way he had come in, through the front door. No one moved to stop him. Outside, the square was empty. It had begun to rain. Stark stood for a moment on the steps. He was angry, and filled with a dangerous unease, the hair-trigger nervousness of a tiger that senses the beaters creeping toward him up the wind. He would almost have welcomed the sight of Malthor and the three young men, but there was nothing to fight but the silence and the rain. He stepped out into the mud, wet and warm around his ankles. An idea came to him, and he smiled, beginning to move now with a definite purpose, along the side of the square. The sharp downpour strengthened. Rain smoked from Stark's naked shoulders, beat against thatch and mud with a hissing rattle. The harbor had disappeared behind boiling clouds of fog, where the water struck the surface of the Red Sea and was turned again instantly by chemical action into vapor. The quays and the neighboring streets were being swallowed up by the impenetrable mist. Lightning came with an eerie bluish flare, and thunder came rolling after it. Stark turned up the narrow way that led toward the castle. Its lights were winking out now, one by one, blotted by the creeping fog. Lightning etched its shadowy bulk against the night, and then was gone. And through the noise of the thunder that followed, Stark thought he heard a voice calling. He stopped, half crouching, his hand on his gun. The cry came again, a girl's voice, thin as the wail of a sea-bird through the driving rain. Then he saw her, a small white blur in the street behind him, running, and even in that dim glimpse of her every line of her body was instinct with fright. Stark set his back against the wall and waited. There did not seem to be anyone with her, though it was hard to tell in the darkness and the storm. She came up to him and stopped, just out of his reach, looking at him and away again with a painful irresoluteness. A bright flash showed her to him clearly. She was young, not long out of her childhood, and pretty in a stupid sort of way. Just now her mouth trembled on the edge of weeping, and her eyes were very large and scared. Her skirt clung to her long thighs, and above it her naked body, hardly fleshed into womanhood, glistened like snow in the wet. Her pale hair hung dripping over her shoulders. Stark said gently, "What do you want with me?" She looked at him, so miserably like a wet puppy, that he smiled. And as though that smile had taken what little resolution she had out of her, she dropped to her knees, sobbing. "I can't do it," she wailed. "He'll kill me, but I just can't do it." "Do what?" asked Stark. She stared up at him. "Run away," she urged him. "Run away now. You'll die in the swamps, but that's better than being one of the lost ones." She shook her thin arms at him. "Run away!" Part 4 of Enchantress of Venus. The street was empty. Nothing showed. Nothing stirred anywhere. Stark leaned over and pulled the girl to her feet, drawing her in under the shelter of the thatched eaves. "Now then," he said, "suppose you stop crying and tell me what this is all about." Presently, between gulps and hiccups, he got the story out of her. "I'm Zareth," she said, "Malthor's daughter. He's afraid of you because of what you did to him on the ship, so he ordered me to watch you in the square when you would come out of the tavern. Then I was to follow you, and—" She broke off, and Stark patted her shoulder. "Go on." But a new thought had occurred to her. "If I do, will you promise not to beat me, or—" She looked at his gun and shivered. "I promise." She studied his face, what she could see of it in the darkness, and then seemed to lose some of her fear. "I was to stop you. I was to say what I've already said, about being Malthor's daughter and the rest of it, and then I was to say that he wanted me to lead you into an ambush while pretending to help you escape. But that I couldn't do it, and would help you to escape anyhow, because I hated Malthor and the whole business about the lost ones. So you would believe me and follow me, and I would lead you into the ambush." She shook her head and began to cry again, quietly this time, and there was nothing of the woman about her at all now. She was just a child, very miserable and afraid. Stark was glad he had branded Malthor. "But I can't lead you into the ambush. I do hate Malthor, even if he is my father, because he beats me. And the lost ones," she paused. "Sometimes I hear them at night, chanting away out there beyond the mist. It's a very terrible sound." "It is," said Stark. "I've heard it. Who are the lost ones, Zareth?" "I can't tell you that," said Zareth. "It's forbidden even to speak of them. And anyway," she finished honestly, "I don't even know. People disappear, that's all. Not our own people of Shuruun, at least not very often, but strangers like you, and I'm sure my father goes off into the swamps to hunt among the tribes there, and I'm sure he comes back from some of his voyages with nothing in his hold but men from some captured ship. Why, or what for, I don't know, except I've heard the chanting." "They live out there in the Gulf, do they, the lost ones?" "They must. There are many islands there." "And what of the Luhari, the lords of Shuruun? Don't they know what's going on, or are they part of it?" She shuddered and said, "It's not for us to question the Luhari, or even to wonder what they do. Those who have are gone from Shuruun, nobody knows where." Stark nodded. He was silent for a moment, thinking. Then Zareth's little hand touched his shoulder. "Go," she said. "Lose yourself in the swamps. You're strong, and there's something about you different from other men. You may live to find your way through." "No, I have something to do before I leave Shuruun." He took Zareth's damp fair head between his hands and kissed her on the forehead. "You're a sweet child, Zareth, and a brave one. Tell Malthor that you did exactly as he told you, and it was not your fault I wouldn't follow you." "He will beat me anyway," said Zareth philosophically, "but perhaps not quite so hard." "He'll have no reason to beat you at all, if you tell him the truth, that I would not go off with you because my mind was set on going to the castle of the Luhari." There was a long, long silence, while Zareth's eyes widened slowly in horror, and the rain beat on the thatch, and fog and thunder rolled together across Shuruun. "To the castle?" she whispered. "Oh, no! Go into the swamps, or let Malthor take you, but don't go to the castle." She took hold of his arm, her fingers biting into his flesh with the urgency of her plea. "You're a stranger. You don't know. Please, don't go up there." "Why not?" asked Stark. "Are the Luhari demons? Do they devour men?" He loosened her hands gently. "You'd better go now. Tell your father where I am, if he wishes to come after me." Zareth backed away slowly, out into the rain, staring at him as though she had looked at someone standing on the brink of hell, not dead, but worse than dead. Wonder showed in her face, and through it a great yearning pity. She tried once to speak, then shook her head and turned away, breaking into a run as though she could not endure to look upon Stark any longer. In a second she was gone. Stark looked at her for a moment, strangely touched. Then he stepped out into the rain again, heading upward along the steep path that led to the castle of the lords of Shuruun. The mist was blinding. Stark had to feel his way, as he climbed higher, above the level of the town. He was lost in the sullen redness. A hot wind blew, and each flare of light turned the crimson fog into a hellish purple. The night was full of vast hissing, where the rain poured into the gulf. He stopped once to hide his gun in a cleft between the rocks. At length he stumbled against a carven pillar of black stone and found the gate that hung from it, a massive thing sheathed in metal. It was barred, and the pounding of his fists upon it made little sound. Then he saw the gong, a huge disk of beaten gold beside the gate. He picked up the hammer that lay there, and set the deep voice of the gong rolling out between the thunderbolts. A bare slit opened and a man's eyes looked out at him. Stark dropped the hammer. "Open up," he shouted. "I would speak with the Luhari." From within he heard an echo of laughter. Scraps of voices came to him on the wind, and then more laughter. And then, slowly, the great valves of the gate creaked open, wide enough only to admit him. He stepped through, and the gateway shut behind him with a ringing clash. He stood in a huge open court. Enclosed within its walls was a village of thatched huts, with open sheds for cooking, and behind them were pens for stabling the beasts, the wingless dragons of the swamps that can be caught and broken to the goad. He saw only vague glimpses because of the fog. The men who had led him in clustered around him, thrusting him forward into the light that streamed from the huts. "He would speak with the Luhari," one of them shouted, to the women and children who stood in the doorways watching. The words were picked up and tossed around the court, and a great burst of laughter went up. Stark eyed them, saying nothing. They were a puzzling breed. The men, obviously, were soldiers and guards to the Luhari, for they wore the harness of fighting men. As obviously these were their wives and children, all living behind the castle walls and having little to do with Shuruun. But it was their racial characteristics that surprised him. They had interbred with the pale tribes of the swamp edges that had peopled Shuruun, and there were many with milk-white hair and broad faces. Yet even these bore an alien stamp. Stark was puzzled, for the race he would have named was unknown here behind the mountains of white cloud, and almost unknown anywhere on Venus at sea level, among the sweltering marshes and the eternal fogs. They stared at him even more curiously, remarking on his skin and his black hair and the unfamiliar modeling of his face. The women nudged each other and whispered, giggling, and one of them said aloud, "They'll need a barrel hoop to collar that neck." The guards closed in around him. "Well, if you wish to see the Luhari, you shall," said the leader, "but first we must make sure of you." Spear points ringed him round. Stark made no resistance while they stripped him of all he had, except for his shorts and sandals. He had expected that, and it amused him, for there was little enough for them to take. "All right," said the leader, "come on." The whole village turned out in the rain to escort Stark to the castle door. There was about them the same ominous interest that the people of Shuruun had had, with one difference. They knew what was supposed to happen to him, knew all about it, and were therefore doubly appreciative of the game. A great doorway was square and plain, and yet neither crude nor ungraceful. The castle itself was built of the black stone, each block perfectly cut and fitted, and the door itself was sheathed in the same metal as the gate, darkened but not corroded. The leader of the guard cried out to the warder, "Here is one who would speak with the Luhari." The warder laughed, "And so he shall. Their night is long and dull." He flung open the heavy door and cried the word down the hallway. Stark could hear it echoing hollowly within, and presently from the shadows came servants clad in silks and wearing jeweled collars, and from the guttural sound of their laughter Stark knew that they had no tongues. Stark faltered then. The doorway loomed hollowly before him, and it came to him suddenly that evil lay behind it, and that perhaps Zareth was wiser than he when she warned him from the Luhari. Then he thought of Helvi, and of other things, and lost his fear in anger. Lightning burned the sky. The last cry of the dying storm shook the ground under his feet. He thrust the grinning warder aside and strode into the castle, bringing a veil of the red fog with him, and did not listen to the closing of the door, which was stealthy and quiet as the footfall of approaching death. Torches burned here and there along the walls, and by their smoky glare he could see that the hallway was like the entrance, square and unadorned, faced with the black rock. It was high and wide, and there was about the architecture a calm, reflective dignity that had its own beauty, in some ways more impressive than the sensuous loveliness of the ruined palaces he had seen on Mars. There were no carvings here, no paintings nor frescoes. It seemed that the builders had felt that the hall itself was enough, in its massive perfection of line and the sombre gleam of polished stone. The only decoration was in the window embrasures. These were empty now, open to the sky with the red fog wreathing through them, but there were still scraps of jewel-toned panes clinging to the fretwork, to show what they had once been. A strange feeling swept over Stark. Because of his wild upbringing, he was abnormally sensitive to the sort of impressions that most men receive either dully or not at all. Walking down the hall, preceded by the tongueless creatures in their bright silks and blazing collars, he was struck by a subtle difference in the place. The castle itself was only an extension of the minds of its builders, a dream shaped into reality. Stark felt that the dark, cool, curiously timeless dream had not originated in a mind like his own, nor like that of any man he had ever seen. Then the end of the hall was reached, the way barred by low broad doors of gold fashioned in the same chaste simplicity. A soft scurrying of feet, a shapeless tittering from the servants, a glancing of malicious, mocking eyes. The golden doors swung open, and Stark was in the presence of the Luhari. Part 5 of Enchantress of Venus. They had the appearance, in that first glance, of creatures glimpsed in a fever dream, very bright and distant, robed in a misty glow that gave them an illusion of unearthly beauty. The place in which the earthmen now stood was like a cathedral for breadth and loftiness. Most of it was in darkness, so that it seemed to reach without limit above and on all sides, as though the walls were only shadowy phantasms of the night itself. The polished black stone under his feet held a dim translucent gleam, depthless as water in a black tarn. There was no substance anywhere. Far away in this shadowy vastness burned a cluster of lamps, a galaxy of little stars to shed a silvery light upon the lords of Shuruun. There had been no sound in the place when Stark entered, for the opening of the golden doors had caught the attention of the Luhari and held it in contemplation of the stranger. Stark began to walk toward them in this utter stillness. Quite suddenly, in the impenetrable gloom somewhere to his right, there came a sharp scuffling and a scratching of reptilian claws, a hissing and a sort of low, angry muttering, all magnified and distorted by the echoing vault into a huge demonic whispering that swept all around him. Stark whirled around, crouched and ready. His eyes blazed and his body bathed in cold sweat. The noise increased, rushing toward him. From the distant glow of the lamps came a woman's tinkling laughter, thin crystal broken against the vault. The hissing and snarling rose to hollow crescendo, and Stark saw a blurred shape bounding at him. His hands reached out to receive the rush, but it never came. The strange shape resolved itself into a boy of about 10, who dragged after him on a bit of rope a young dragon, new and toothless from the egg, and protesting with all its strength. Stark straightened up, feeling let down and furious, and relieved. The boy scowled at him through a forelock of silver curls. Then he called him a very dirty word and rushed away, kicking and hauling at the little beast until it ragged like the father of all dragons and sounded like it too, in that vast echo-chamber. A voice spoke, slow, harsh, sexless. It rang thinly through the vault. Thin, but a steel blade is thin too. It speaks inexorably, and its word is final. The voice said, "Come here, into the light." Stark obeyed the voice. As he approached the lamps, the aspect of the Luhari changed and steadied. Their beauty remained, but it was not the same. They had looked like angels. Now that he could see them clearly, Stark thought that they might have been the children of Lucifer himself. There were 6 of them, counting the boy. 2 men, about the same age as Stark, with some complicated gambling game forgotten between them. A woman, beautiful, gowned in white silk, sitting with her hands in her lap, doing nothing. A woman, younger, not so beautiful perhaps, but with a look of stormy and bitter vitality. She wore a short tunic of crimson, and a stout leather glove on her left hand, which perched a flying thing of prey with its fierce eyes hooded. The boy stood beside the two men, his head poised arrogantly. From time to time he cuffed the little dragon, and it snapped at him with its impotent jaws. He was proud of himself for doing that. Stark wondered how he would behave with the beast when it had grown its fangs. Opposite him, crouched on a heap of cushions, was a third man. He was deformed, with an ungainly body and long spidery arms, and in his lap a sharp knife lay on a block of wood, half formed into the shape of an obese creature, half woman, half pure evil. Stark saw with a flash of surprise that the face of the deformed young man, of all the faces there, was truly human, truly beautiful. His eyes were old in his boyish face, wise, and very sad in their wisdom. He smiled upon the stranger, and his smile was more compassionate than tears. They looked at Stark, all of them, with restless, hungry eyes. They were the pure breed that had left its stamp of alienage on the pale-haired folk of the swamps, the serfs who dwelt in the huts outside. They were of the cloud people, the folk of the high plateaus, kings of the land on the farther slopes of the mountains of white cloud. It was strange to see them here, on the dark side of the barrier wall, but here they were. How had they come, and why, leaving their rich cool plains for the fetor of these foreign swamps? He could not guess. But there was no mistaking them. The proud fine shaping of their bodies, their alabaster skin, their eyes that were all colours and none, like the dawn sky, their hair that was pure warm silver. They did not speak. They seemed to be waiting for permission to speak, and Stark wondered which one of them had voiced that steely summons. Then it came again. "Come here, come closer." And he looked beyond them, beyond the circle of lamps into the shadows again, and saw the speaker. She lay upon a low bed, her head propped on silken pillows, her vast, her incredibly gigantic body covered with a silken pall. Only her arms were bare, two shapeless masses of white flesh ending in tiny hands. From time to time she stretched one out and took a morsel of food from the supply laid ready beside her, snuffing and wheezing with the effort, and then gulped the tidbit down with a horrible voracity. Her features had long ago dissolved into a shaky formlessness, with the exception of her nose, which rose out of the fat, curved and cruel and thin, like the bony beak of the creature that sat on the girl's wrist and dreamed its hooded dreams of blood. And her eyes. Stark looked into her eyes and shuddered. Then he glanced at the carving half formed in the cripple's lap, and knew what thought had guided the knife. Half woman, half pure evil. And strong, very strong. Her strength lay in her naked eyes for all to see, and it was an ugly strength. It could tear down mountains, but it could never build. He saw her looking at him. Her eyes bored into his as though they would search out his very guts and study them, and he knew that she expected him to turn away, unable to bear her gaze. He did not. Presently he smiled and said, "I have outstared a rock lizard to determine which of us should eat the other. And I've outstared the very rock while waiting for him." She knew that he spoke the truth. Stark expected her to be angry, but she was not. A vague mountainous rippling shook her and emerged at length as a voiceless laughter. "You see that?" she demanded, addressing the others. "You whelps of the Luhari, not one of you dares to face me down, and yet here is a great dark creature from the gods nowhere who can stand and shame you." She glanced again at Stark. "What demon's blood brought you forth, that you have learned neither prudence nor fear?" Stark answered somberly, I learned them both before I could walk, but I learned another thing also, a thing called anger." "And you are angry?" "Ask Malfour if I am, and why." He saw the two men start a little, and a slow smile crossed the girl's face. "Malfour," said the hulk upon the bed, and ate a mouthful of roast meat dripping with fat. "That is interesting. But rage against Malfour did not bring you here. I am curious, stranger. Speak." "I will." Stark glanced around. The place was a tomb, a trap. The very air smelled of danger. The younger folk watched him in silence. Not one of them had spoken since he came in, except the boy who had cursed him, and that was unnatural in itself. The girl leaned forward, idly stroking the creature on her wrist so that it stirred and ran its knife-like talons in and out of their bony sheaths with sensuous pleasure. Her gaze on Stark was bold and cool, oddly challenging. Of them all, he alone saw him as a man. To the others he was a problem, a diversion, something less than human. Stark said, "A man came to Shuruun at the time of the last rains. His name was Helvi, and he was son of a little king by Yarel. He came seeking his brother, who had broken taboo and fled for his life. Helvi came to tell him that the ban was lifted, and he might return. Neither one came back." The small evil eyes were amused, blinking in their tallowy creases. "And so?" "And so I have come after Helvi, who is my friend." Again there was the heaving of that bulk of flesh, the explosion of laughter that hissed and wheezed in snake-like echoes through the vault. "Friendship must run deep with you, stranger. Ah, well, the Luhari are kind of heart. You shall find your friend." And as though that were the signal to end their deferential silence, the younger folk burst into laughter also, until the vast hall rang with it, giving back the sound like demons laughing on the edge of hell. The cripple only did not laugh, but bent his bright head over his carving and sighed. The girl sprang up. "Not yet, grandmother. Keep him a while." The cold, cruel eyes shifted to her. "And what will you do with him, Vara? Haul him about on a string, like Bor with his wretched beast?" "Perhaps, though I think it would need a stout chain to hold him." Vara turned and looked at Stark, bold and bright, taking in the breadth and height of him, the shaping of the great smooth muscles, the iron line of the jaw. She smiled. Her mouth was very lovely, like the red fruit of the swamp tree that bears death in its pungent sweetness. "Here is a man," she said, "the first man I have seen since my father died." The two men at the gaming table rose, their faces flushed and angry. One of them strode forward and gripped the girl's arm roughly. "So I am not a man," he said with surprising gentleness. "A sad thing for one who is to be your husband. It is best that we settle that now, before we wed." Vara nodded. Stark saw that the man's fingers were cutting savagely into the firm muscle of her arm, but she did not wince. "High time to settle it all, Egil. You have borne enough from me. The day is long overdue for my taming. I must learn now to bend my neck, and acknowledge my lord." For a moment Stark thought she meant it. The note of mockery in her voice was so subtle. Then the woman in white, who all this time had not moved or changed expression, voiced again the thin, tinkling laugh he had heard once before. From that, and the dark suffusion of blood in Egil's face, Stark knew that Vara was only casting the man's own phrases back at him. The boy let out one derisive bark, and was cuffed into silence. Vara looked straight at Stark. "Will you fight for me?" she demanded. Quite suddenly it was Stark's turn to laugh. "No," he said. Vara shrugged. "Very well, then. I must fight for myself." "Man," snarled Egil, "I'll show you who's a man, you scapegrace little vixen." He wrenched off his girdle with his free hand, at the same time bending the girl around so he could get a fair shot at her. The creature of prey, a Terran falcon, clung to her wrist, beating its wings and screaming, its hooded head jerking. With a motion so quick that it was hardly visible, Vara slipped the hood and flew the creature straight for Eagle's face. He let go, flinging up his arms to ward off the talons and the tearing beak. The wide wings beat and hammered. Eagle yelled. The boy boar got out of range and danced up and down, shrieking with delight. Vara stood quietly. The bruises were blackening on her arm, but she did not deign to touch them. Eagle blundered against the gaming table and sent the ivory pieces flying. Then he tripped over a cushion and fell flat, and the hungry talons ripped his tunic to ribbons down the back. Vara whistled, a clear, peremptory call. The creature gave a last peck at the back of Eagle's head and flopped suddenly back to its perch on her wrist. She held it, turning toward Stark. He knew from the poise of her that she was on the verge of launching her pet at him. But she studied him and then shook her head. "No," she said, and slipped the hood back on. "You would kill it." Eagle had scrambled up and gone off into the darkness, sucking a cut on his arm. His face was black with rage. The other man looked at Vara. "If you were pledged to me," he said, "I'd have that temper out of you." "Come and try it," answered Vara. The man shrugged and sat down. "It's not my place. I keep the peace in my own house." He glanced at the woman in white, and Stark saw that her face, hitherto blank of any expression, had taken on a look of abject fear. "You do," said Vara, "and if I were Errol, I would stab you while you slept. But you're safe. She had no spirit to begin with." Errol shivered and looked steadfastly at her hands. The man began to gather up the scattered pieces. He said casually, "Eagle will wring your neck some day, Vara, and I shan't weep to see it." All this time the old woman had eaten and watched and eaten, her eyes glittering with interest. "A pretty brood, are they not?" she demanded of Stark. "Full of spirit, quarrelling like young hawks in the nest. That's why I keep them around me, so that they are such sport to watch. All except Treon there." She indicated the crippled youth. "He does nothing. Dull and soft mouth, worse than Errol. What a grandson to be cursed with! But his sister has fire enough for two." She munched a sweet, grunting with pride. Treon raised his head and spoke, and his voice was like music, echoing with an eerie liveliness in that dark place. "Dull I may be, grandmother, and weak in body, and without hope. Yet I shall be the last of the Luhari. Death sits waiting on the towers, and he shall gather you all before me. I know, for the winds have told me." He turned his suffering eyes upon Stark and smiled, a smile of such woe and resignation that the earthman's heart ached with it. Yet there was a thankfulness in it too, as though some long waiting was over at last. "You," he said softly, "stranger with the fierce eyes, I saw you come, out of the darkness, and where you set foot there was a bloody print. Your arms were red to the elbows, and your breast was splashed with the redness, and on your brow was the symbol of death. Then I knew, and the wind whispered into my ear, 'It is so. This man shall put the castle down, and its stone shall crush Shuruun and set the lost ones free.'" He laughed very quietly. "Look at him, all of you, for he will be your doom." There was a moment's silence, and Stark, with all the superstitions of a wild race thick within him, turned cold to the roots of his hair. Then the old woman said disgustedly, "Have the winds warned you of this, my idiot?" With astonishing force and accuracy she picked up a ripe fruit and flung it at Treon. "Stop your mouth with that," she told him. "I'm weary to death of your prophecies." Treon looked at the crimson juice trickling down the breast of his tunic, to drip upon the carving in his lap. The half-formed head was covered with it. Treon was shaking with silent mirth. "Well," said Vara, coming up to Stark, "what do you think of the Luhari? The proud Luhari, who would not stoop to mingle their blood with the cattle of the swamps? My half-witted brother, my worthless cousins, that little monster boar who is the last twig of the three. Do you wonder I flew my falcon at Egil?" She waited for an answer, her head thrown back, the silver curls framing her face like wisps of storm cloud. There was a swagger about her that at once irritated and delighted Stark. A hell-cat, he thought, but a mighty fetching one, and bold as brass. Bold and honest. Her lips were parted, midway between her anger and a smile. He caught her to him suddenly and kissed her, holding her slim, strong body as though she were a doll. He was in no hurry to set her down. When at last he did, he grinned and said, "Was that what you wanted?" "Yes," answered Vara, "that was what I wanted." She spun about, her jaw set dangerously. "Grandmother!" She got no farther. Stark saw that the old woman was attempting to sit upright, her face purpling with effort and the most terrible wrath he had ever seen. "You!" she gasped at the girl. She choked on her fury and her shortness of breath, and then Egil came soft-footed into the light, bearing in his hand a thing made of black metal and oddly shaped, with a blunt, thick muzzle. "Lie back, grandmother," he said. "I had a mind to use this on Vara." Even as he spoke he pressed a stud, and Stark, in the act of leaping for the sheltering darkness, crashed down and lay like a dead man. There had been no sound, no flash, nothing, but a vast hand that smote him suddenly into oblivion. Egil finished, "But I see a better target." Part 6 of Enchantress of Venus. Red, red, red. The color of blood. Blood in his eyes. He was remembering now. The quarry had turned on him, and they had fought on the bare, blistering rocks. Nor had N'Chaka killed. The Lord of the Rocks was very big, a giant among lizards, and N'Chaka was small. The Lord of the Rocks had laid open N'Chaka's head before the wooden spear had more than scratched his flank. It was strange that N'Chaka still lived. The Lord of the Rocks must have been fully fed, only that saved him. N'Chaka groaned, not with pain, but with shame. He had failed. Hoping for great triumph, he had disobeyed the tribal law that forbids a boy to hunt the quarry of a man, and he had failed. Old One would not reward him with the girdle and the flint spear of manhood. Old One would give him to the women for punishment of little whips. Tika would laugh at him, and it would be many seasons before Old One would grant him permission to try the man's hunt. Blood in his eyes. He blinked to clear them. The instinct of survival was prodding him. He must arouse himself and creep away, before the Lord of Rocks returned to eat him. The redness would not go away. It swam and flowed, strangely sparkling. He blinked again, and tried to lift his head, and could not, and fear struck down upon him like the iron frost of night upon the rocks of the valley. It was all wrong. He could see himself clearly, a naked boy dizzy with pain, rising and clambering over the ledges and the shale to the safety of the cave. He could see that, and yet he could not move. All wrong. Time, space, the universe, darkened and turned. A voice spoke to him, a girl's voice. Not Tika's, and the speech was strange. Tika was dead. Memories rushed through his mind. The bitter things, the cruel things. Old One was dead, and all the others. The voice spoke again, calling him by that name that was not his own. Stark. Memory shattered into a kaleidoscope of broken pictures, fragments, rushing, spinning. He was adrift among them. He was lost, and the terror of it brought a scream to his throat. Soft hands touching his face, gentle words, swift and soothing. The redness cleared and steadied, though it did not go away, and quite suddenly he was himself again, with all his memories where they belonged. He was lying on his back, and Zareth, Malthor's daughter, was looking down at him. He knew now what the redness was. He had seen it too often before not to know. He was somewhere at the bottom of the Red Sea, that weird ocean in which a man can breathe. And he could not move. That had not changed nor gone away. His body was dead. The terror he had felt before was nothing to the agony that filled him now. He lay entombed in his own flesh, staring up at Zareth, wanting an answer to a question he dared not ask. She understood from the look in his eyes. "It's all right," she said, and smiled. "It will wear off. You'll be all right. It's only the weapon of the Luhari. Somehow it puts the body to sleep, but it will wake again." Stark remembered the black object that Egil had held in his hands. A projector of some sort, then beaming a current of high-frequency vibration that paralyzed the nerve centers. He was amazed. The Cloud people were barbarians themselves, though on a higher scale than the swamp-edge tribes, and certainly had no such scientific proficiency. He wondered where the Luhari had got hold of such a weapon. It didn't really matter, not just now. Relief swept over him, bringing him dangerously close to tears. The effect would wear off. At the moment, that was all he cared about. He looked up at Zareth again. Her pale hair floated with the slow breathing of the sea, a milky cloud against the spark-shot crimson. He saw now that her face was drawn and shadowed, and there a terrible hopelessness in her eyes. She had been alive when he first saw her, frightened, not too bright, but full of emotion and a certain dogged courage. Now the spark was gone, crushed out. She wore a collar around her white neck, a ring of metal with the ends fused together for all time. "Where are we?" he asked. And she answered, her voice carrying deep and hollow in the dense substance of the sea. "We're in the place of the lost ones." Stark looked beyond her, as far as he could see, since he was unable to turn his head, and wonder came to him. Black walls, black vault above him. A vast hall filled with a wash of the sea that slipped in streaks of whispering flame through the high embrasures. A hall that was twin to the vault of shadows where he had met the Luhari. "There is a city," said Zareth dully. "You will see it soon. You will see nothing else until you die." Stark said, very gently, "How do you come here, little one?" "Because of my father. I will tell you all I know, which is little enough. Malthor has been slaver to the Luhari for a long time. There are a number of them among the captains of Shuruun. But that is a thing that is never spoken of. So I, his daughter, could only guess. I was sure of it when he sent me after you." She laughed, a bitter sound. "Now I'm here, with the collar of the lost ones on my neck. But Malthor is here too." She laughed again, ugly laughter to come from a young mouth. Then she looked at Stark, and her hand reached out timidly to touch his hair in what was almost a caress. Her eyes were wide and soft and full of tears. "Why didn't you go into the swamps when I warned you?" Stark answered stolidly, "Too late to worry about that now." Then, "You say Malthor is here a slave?" "Yes." Again, that look of wonder and admiration in her eyes. "I don't know what you said or did to the Luhari, but the Lord Egil came down in a black rage and cursed my father for a blundering fool because he could not hold you. My father whined and made excuses, and all would have been well, only his curiosity got the better of him, and he asked the Lord Egil what had happened. You were like a wild beast, Malthor said, and he hoped you had not harmed the Lady Vara, as he could see from Egil's wounds that there had been trouble. The Lord Egil turned quite purple. I thought he was going to fall in a fit." "Yes," said Stark, "it was the wrong thing to say." The ludicrous side of it struck him, and he was suddenly roaring with laughter. Malthor should have kept his mouth shut. Egil called his guard and ordered them to take Malthor. and when he realized what had happened, Malthor turned on me, trying to say that it was all my fault, that I let you escape." Stark stopped laughing. Her voice went on slowly. "Egil seems quite mad with fury. I have heard that the Luhari are all mad, and I think it is so. At any rate, he ordered me taken too, for he wanted to stamp Malthor's seed into the mud forever. So here we are." There was a long silence. Stark could think of no word of comfort, and as for hope, he had better wait until he was sure he could at least raise his head. Egil might have damaged him permanently, out of spite. In fact, he was surprised he wasn't dead. He glanced again at the collar on Zareth's neck. Slave. Slave to the Luhari, in the city of the Lost Ones. What the devil did they do with slaves at the bottom of the sea? The heavy gases conducted sound remarkably well, except for an odd property of diffusion, which made it seem that a voice came from everywhere at once. Now, all at once, Stark became aware of a dull clamour of voices drifting towards him. He tried to see, and Zareth turned his head carefully so that he might. The Lost Ones were returning from whatever work it was they did. Out of the dim red murk beyond the open door they swam, into the long, long vastness of the hall that was filled with the same red murk, moving slowly, their white bodies trailing wakes of sullen flame. The host of the damned drifting through a strange, red-litten hell, weary and without hope. One by one they sank onto pallets laid in rows on the black stone floor, and lay there, utterly exhausted, their pale hair lifting and floating with the slow eddies of the sea. And each one wore a collar. One man did not lie down. He came toward Stark, a tall barbarian who drew himself with great strokes of his arm so that he was wrapped in wheeling sparks. Stark knew his face. "Helvi," he said, and smiled in welcome. "Brother." Helvi crouched down, a great handsome boy he had been the time Stark saw him. But he was a man now, with all the laughter turned to grim deep lines around his mouth and the bones of his face standing out like granite ridges. "Brother," he said again, looking at Stark through a glitter of unshamed tears. "Fool!" And he cursed Stark savagely because he had come to Shuruun to look for an idiot who had gone the same way, and was already as good as dead. "Would you have followed me?" asked Stark. "But I am only an ignorant child of the swamps," said Helvi. "You come from space. You know other worlds. You can read and write. You should have better sense." Stark grinned. "And I'm still an ignorant child of the rocks. So we're two fools together." "Where is Tobal?" Tobal was Helvi's brother, who had broken taboo and looked for refuge in Shuruun. Apparently he had found peace at last, for Helvi shook his head. "A man cannot live too long under the sea. It is not enough merely to breathe and eat. Tobal overran his time, and I am close to the end of mine." He held up his hand and then swept it down sharply, watching the broken fires dance along his arms. "The mind breaks before the body," said Helvi casually, as though it were a matter of no importance. Zareth spoke. "Helvi has guarded you each period while the others slept." "And not I alone," said Helvi. "The little one stood with me." "Guarded me," said Stark. "Why?" Helvi gestured toward a pallet not far away. Malthor lay there, his eyes half open and full of malice, the fresh scar livid on his cheek. "He feels," said Helvi, "that you should not have fought upon his ship." Stark felt an inward chill of horror. To lie here helpless, watching Malthor come toward him with open fingers reaching for his helpless throat. He made a passionate effort to move, and gave up, gasping. Helvi grinned. "Now is the time I should wrestle you, Stark, for I never could throw you before." He gave Stark's head a shake, very gentle for all its apparent roughness. "You'll be throwing me again. Sleep now, and don't worry." He settled himself to watch, and presently, in spite of himself, Stark slept, with Zareth curled at his feet like a little dog. There was no time down there in the heart of the Red Sea. No daylight, no dawn, no space of darkness. No winds blew, no rain nor storm broke the endless silence. Only the lazy currents whispered by on their way to nowhere, and the red sparks danced, and the great hall waited, remembering the past. Stark waited too. How long he never knew, but he was used to waiting. He had learned his patience on the knees of the great mountains whose heads lift proudly into open space to look at the sun, and he had absorbed their own contempt for time. Little by little, life returned to his body. A mongrel guard came now and again to examine him, pricking Stark's flesh with his knife to test the reaction, so that Stark should not malinger. He reckoned without Stark's control. The Earthman bore his prodding without so much as a twitch, until his limbs were completely his own again. Then he sprang up and pitched the man half the length of the hall, turning over and over, yelling with startled anger. At the next period of labor, Stark was driven with the rest out into the city of the Lost Ones.